So I'm now going to, with no further ado, go on to hand over to our next speaker, Danny Dorling. And I know Danny Dorling will be very well known to many of you in the room, and particularly his work. He's a prolific writer and researcher. He's a professor at geography at Oxford University and the author of this fantastic book, 7 Children, Inequality and Britain's Next Generation. I can't recommend the book highly enough. It's incredibly readable, and it's an incredibly readable account of inequality in Britain, in which he rather skillfully turns what could be shocking but rather dry statistics into very moving human stories. So, Danny Dorling.
Thank you. I'm going to see if this works. Can you hear me okay? Great, I don't have to hold it. I should tell you a tiny bit about myself. I'm a professor at the university, but the much more relevant thing is I grew up in this city in the late 60s, 1970s, early 1980s. I was a council worker for 6 weeks of the year. I worked on play schemes in Quarry in 1986, 1987, 1988, when we properly funded youth work in the city, when we had large numbers of people looking after children in the summers, when this city was far more equal than it is today. Children were excluded from school in the 1970s and 80s, but at nothing like the rate they are now. It's the growing inequality in society and the not understanding of each other that has led to this terrible situation at the moment. And it was interesting to talk about trying to get children from the outside to come into the city. And of course there were always some children who didn't come in. But in the late 1970s and the 80s, Cornmarket was ours. Right? The students didn't dare go onto it. Right? So you mustn't think this city was always as polarised in this way as it is now. Back then, salaries in the car works were good, which is why the city was much more equal, and why the children of the city were living remarkably more equal lives to the ones that they're living today. Don't look back and think it was terrible. There was in particular a point in Oxford history when the 11 plus went, when nobody knew what a good and a bad state school was. Charwell used to be the bottom end secondary modern, if you didn't know. And the top county grammar is what became later Peers and so on. And that transition, I was lucky to go up in that period, the transition from that division through to the division we have today was a time of great equality in the city. I'm going to start with what to do or what can be done, because I get tired of people saying it's complicated. And I get tired of that because of what has happened in the world. The United Nations produces a detailed report every few years on child poverty worldwide. And in particular, they concentrate on the richest 30 or 35 countries in the world. Their latest report ends in the 7-year period to around 2022. And that shows that in the large majority of the rich countries of the world, child poverty has fallen. At the best, it has fallen by 30% in countries like Chile. Better than average, it has fallen by 20%. Average falls in child poverty have been 10%. These are children living on 60% of median income in those families. There are a small number of countries where it has risen. There are 4 countries where it has risen by 10%, but they are all countries doing remarkably well. Countries like Iceland and so on, where the poverty rate in Norway and Switzerland, where it's very low. But still, people there are ashamed about a 10% rise. And then there is only one country in the whole of the world where the United Nations has recorded a 20% rise in child poverty, and that's the United Kingdom. and we were already bad. So we are utterly extreme. And the idea that this is difficult, when you look at what the average rich country in the world does, is stupid. To be told, oh, it's very hard, it's very complicated, the bond markets won't like it, we've got our fiscal rules that have been changed 10 times. Right? It is stupid, and we have to ask ourselves, how have we ended up with such stupid people at the top of our cabinet? And I am a member of the Labour Party, but I still find it remarkable. How can they be so cosseted in their dinner parties in a particular part of West London where it's okay to say we're a country of strangers, and their friends still talk to them? I mean, it is remarkable, and we need to start calling this out very, very abruptly. The worst record in the rich world. So what can you do? And again, this is where I lose my patience when people say it's very difficult. Because you don't have to go to another European country to see what to do. You don't have to ask, what are those policies that worked in Scandinavia? What are the policies that work in Germany? Oh, can we translate them there? We're not quite the same. The country with the best record in Europe, the best recent record of reducing child poverty, is within the United Kingdom. That country is Scotland. It has had the fastest fall in child poverty that you can measure in Europe. The situation in England and Wales is so bad that it counteracts that, so the United Nations record a 20% rise. The latest statistics were released in March of this year, and the 12 areas of the UK which saw falls in child poverty, only 12, were all in Scotland. The regional country of Britain with the lowest rate of child poverty now is Scotland. When I was a child, Scotland had the highest rate of child poverty. Glasgow had one of the worst rates in the whole of Europe. Scotland now has the best rate, not yet falling, but the lowest. What did the Scottish Government do? They implemented a Scottish child payment to all families in receipt of any form of benefit, which is not tapered, which is not withdrawn because of your other benefits, which is now heading towards, the campaign is to get it to £30 a week per child. It's between 25 and 28. They did other things as well, but most importantly, I think politically, the Scottish Government and the SNP came to an agreement with Scottish Labour not to argue about this. So in Scotland, the Labour Party doesn't disagree with the SNP on child poverty or the policies to reduce it. Within the UK, there were some Scottish Labour people who didn't like it. The most famous one is Gordon Brown. And Gordon Brown attacked the policy of the Scottish Government, and the Scottish Labour Party told him to shut up. Right? Which is why Scotland has 12 areas with child poverty falling. This is entirely possible because it is already happening in the UK. It is entirely possible because it's happening in the majority of rich countries in the world. It is only extreme ineptitude and our bizarre social divisions that end up with such cretinous ideas being seen as common sense and grown-up politics at the top that puts us in this position. And we need to call it out and make it shameful when people say it is all very difficult. It is quite difficult to get into this position. It took a lot of work by the Tory party in the 1980s to get our inequality so high. It takes a lot of work by people who believe in inequality to keep these divisions going. It's incredibly expensive. We have the most expensive school system on the planet because 7% of our children go to schools that take 30% of all the resources and have the large majority of the land and the teaching assistants and so on. And you just look at this city, and you look at the schools in this city and the teachers and what they're doing. You couldn't come up with a more inefficient distribution of land for teaching for schools than we have. You have to go to Chile to find anything which is near to it, and that is Oxford. I was going to read you some parts from the book, but I'm going to use up my time, so I won't. But I'll try and explain ways of trying to talk about this which aren't quite as angry as I've just said. And what I've said is what I believe, but you're a particular audience who are particularly bothered. Most people are not interested in political issues most of the time. And if they're interested in one, it's only one. So how do you explain things to people when it is not their priority? I'm going to read you just one thing out of this book, and then I'm going to give you some stats for Oxfordshire, because that may be useful. The book is about 7 children. The poorest child, they're living on £118 a week after paying the rent. That's the equivalent of £1 a week just over 100 years ago. In many ways, the situation of the poorest child has not improved. The middle child, who's called David, is on the median income. That's why they're middle. But the family used to be poorer. So David's older sister still qualifies for free school meals. Hardly any child can now get through and qualify for free school meals. But there's a legacy if you did. I'll read you one part of this to try to explain the kind of thing that goes on. And I'm reading you this because this example actually comes from a school in Oxford now. That's where I got it from. The fact is that David's sister is going hungry. Going hungry at school because she cannot work out what she is allowed to eat. It's not just her who can't work out her entitlement. None of the women and the one man working behind the tills in the canteen can either. None of them have been told that the system is set up so that if David's sister has the set, healthy school lunch and nothing else, this exactly equals her daily entitlement to free school meals, and she can then eat for free. But if she chooses any drink beside tap water, or has a snack at morning break, and then tries to purchase any combination of food for lunch, she will exceed her daily free school meal allowance and be allowed nothing. As the school cafeteria is set up to highlight all the most enticing food options, it's hardly surprising that a 10-year-old would not realise that the only way through this maze of options is to ignore the maze entirely. The private companies that have been running the UK school kitchens since privatisation in the 80s make no profit if children do that. There are story after story of what happens when you are the most unequal country. And each little story can make you angry. But you already are bothered or you wouldn't be here, so I don't need to rile you up with those stories. And they can get very depressing. One problem with all this is you get ground down. That's why it really matters to know how easy it is. Then you can get really angry. Right? Then you can get really, really angry. Scotland isn't bankrupt because its hospital consultants and university professors have to pay a slightly higher tax rate so you can live in a decent country. Right? This is entirely possible, and it is a choice not to do it. It was understandable that the Tory party made people poor. The Tory party believes in inequality. The Tory party believes that a few people are very clever and born to rule, and most of you are stupid, which is why you might be on the left wing. And you don't know how to do things, so you have to be fooled and scared about immigrants and made to vote the right way. And most people aren't worth much money. And we should deter people from having children if they're poor by having a 2-child limit, which George Osborne actually believed would act as a deterrent. That people will work out their benefit, and it turns out there's been studies that they don't. What's happened in Oxfordshire? House of Commons Library, a few weeks ago, released the figures for the new constituencies, the ones we're going to be voting on. There are 7 in the county now. As of March, just a few weeks ago, we have 15,681 children officially poor in the county. In 2018, we had 12,000. It's a 3,000 child rise. The highest numbers and proportions of children that are poor are in Oxford East and in Banbury. But the other 5 constituencies, these leafy home county constituencies, in total have more poor children than Oxford East and Banbury. So don't think anymore about Rose Hill, Barton and Blackbird Leys, because that's a tiny minority of the poor children of Oxfordshire. There is child poverty across this county. In Oxford East, it's around about 20%. In Banbury, it's about 14%, 1 in 7. The lowest it gets to is 8% in Oxford West and Abingdon. Those are the figures before housing costs. This rise, this huge rise, is when we don't even take into account how much money it costs to live in this city. The House of Commons hasn't released, the library hasn't released the figures by constituency after housing costs. The situation then would be to propel the county way up the ranks, over halfway through the country. I'm skipping through so I don't give you too many of these things. But let's just go to the best of constituencies. 5-minute warning. I knew it was coming. The constituencies which had the lowest rate in 2018-2019. Oxford West and Henley and Tame. Less than 7% of children, sorry, these aren't lowest rates, they'll come in a minute. Less than 7% of children were poor in 2018. 2018 is the year I started writing the 7 Children book. In both cases, that's risen up to 8.5, 8.4%. Roughly an extra 2 childs in every 100 in just 5 years. These are places that last saw child poverty widespread in the 1930s, 40s and 50s, rural poverty. Rural Oxfordshire used to be poor. There wasn't electricity and gas connected to the 1960s. The reason George Orwell could live here, because he had no money, was that he could rent a cottage for very little. These places got rich in the late 80s, 90s, 2000, became London commuter belts. And now we're beginning to see the rises. The constituencies most like them are Cheshire, Amersham, Hertford, Stortford, Maidenhead, Theresa May's seat. But none of the constituencies most like them have seen the rises that have occurred in Oxfordshire. So something very strange is going on here. Inequality. Let's just tell you about the undergraduates of the city, because this is interesting, I think. There's a book, and I'll end on time, there's a book called Born to Rule, a brilliant book published just last year. The authors of Born to Rule scanned the whole of Who's Who illegally, and then Who's Who noticed that all of their files from 1870s onwards were being scanned and went to a deal and actually gave them the records. So they have everybody posh, and that when it's ever been recorded. They recorded city people separately, and they got the entire probate records to work out all the wealth of all these people. One thing they discovered is that nobody in Who's Who has ever been completely poor. Everybody has a relative or connection in some way. This is a very class-ridden society. But they also discovered that there are 2 Oxford universities. There are 2 sets of students. One who come still from the upper echelons, but another set, part of the 70% of children from state schools who now come to university, who will never fit in to that group, who don't have connections. And what was interesting, they made one mistake in the book. They published the income distribution of the undergraduates of Oxford, which they got from a freedom of information request to the university. And the income distribution had a quarter of undergraduates coming from families with less than £12,000 a year, the median family being £26,000, but the top 1% being £98,000 a year. And it's easy to see why they made a mistake. What the university actually released, the university I think were a little bit naughty in not making it completely clear, was that these were the undergraduates who'd applied for means-tested benefits because their families were poor. But even their income looked high to the authors. But it's probably about 30% of undergraduates. And that 30% of undergraduates in the university, the old university, Brooks is not as badly off. That 30% of undergraduates in this old university now look like the children of Oxfordshire. And that's a huge change. Right? Things can change. We have undergraduates in this university who have grown up in families as poor as the constituencies of Oxford now are. And that's hopeful. That is a change. We can't anymore accept that this division is in any way understandable, other than by the most crass or stupid or nasty or evil policies from above. Our infant and child mortality rate, the mortality rate between age 1 and 4, has been rising for the last 3 years. Maternal mortality rate, women dying in pregnancy or shortly after, has been rising. It's been rising because suicides have been rising amongst mothers while they're pregnant or shortly after they give birth, because of the circumstances we are putting people in at the point when they have children. I'll end on this. You need to be angry, but you mustn't think that it is a very complicated set of things that need to happen. The first steps are the easiest. It is dealing with the benefit cap, the two-child policy, the fact that in Scotland no child now need go cold or hungry. Later on, there is a society that needs to be rebuilt. If we were to get back to the situation we were in the 60s and 70s, we would have committee after committee in this city building play schemes, building community centres, all the things that we did in the past. Now we have a few committees left, desperately trying to keep the last children's centres open. And that's because we allowed this to happen, and it's because we still give respect to people who are no longer deserving of any respect whatsoever. Thank you very much.